My name is Ae Hee Lee. I will be the interviewer for today. And today is the 26th of February 2015. We are located in the ILS conference room excuse me, at the campus of University of Notre Dame at South Bend, Indiana. I'll be interviewing Maceo Montoya, painter and writer, author of The Deportation of Warper Baranza, The Scoundrel and the Optimist, and Letters to the Poet from His Brother. I would like to thank you for being part of the Oral History Project of the Institute of Latino Studies in the University of Notre Dame.
Thank you.
For the purposes of documentation, could you please tell us your full name, date, and place of birth, and where you're living today?
Okay. My name is Maceo Montoya. I was born in Oakland, California in 1980, October 31st, 1980, and I currently live in Woodland, California, and I grew up in Elmira, California.
Thank you. So to start, I would like to ask you a very general question about how was your childhood, your family? It's okay.
Sure. Well, as I said, I grew up in Elmira, which was just a really small town. My parents wanted to raise their children outside of the city. My dad at the time was working at the California College of Arts and Crafts, and he had different talleres in East Oakland. So I know that it was a big decision for them to decide to leave the Bay Area, and they would just take day trips to look for nice places to live, small towns, and they were actually looking for a town called Dixon, which is just about 10-15 miles down the road from Elmira. And when they drove back to Oakland, they said, let's return there in a couple weeks. And so when they went back, they couldn't find Dixon, but they happened upon Elmira, which really is, it's just this small town, 300 people in the middle of nowhere. And there was a house for sale, and they just jumped. They just put a bid on offer. It was already, I think, I don't know, is it in escrow or something? But they put an offer anyways, and then it ended up falling through for the other people. And so they called my parents once they'd already gone back to the Bay Area, and said, are you still willing to purchase the house? And so it's amazing. But that's, they ended up in Elmira, and I really feel that was. That's like my center. That's still my home, even though eventually leaving for the East Coast for school. But wherever I've gone, it's always important that I'm close. I'm tethered to that small town. But my dad is an artist. I come from a family of artists. My tío Jose was a poet and a painter. He passed away last year. And my cousin Richard Montoya is an actor and a playwright and also a filmmaker. So I grew up in this incredibly rich environment. And on my mother's side, so my mom, she has worked as a photographer and she's a ceramicist, and she was a school teacher for most of my childhood. But her father was a screenwriter. And wrote for television and wrote films, and so even on that side of the family, there's just wherever you look, there was someone who was telling stories, and so that was my childhood, my upbringing. I was always aware of arts and culture, and I guess I'd say just expression.
Wow, all around you. That's great. So then I understand that your father and your family was a big influence on you, as an artist. But I kind of want to know, how did you decide to be a painter? What made you to choose ultimately this path? And if there were other authors or painters, writers that kind of caught your attention or influenced your work?
Yeah. Well, I was always drawing, and it was always part of. It was just something that I did. From a very early age, I knew that I wanted to go to Yale, which is where my grandfather, on my mother's side, where he went to school. And he passed away when I was 11. And so then that just became my goal. I had to go there. The other was I always wanted to be a lawyer. And that was, again, those were the two things that I wanted to do. But I was always drawing and always encouraged. And I just kind of from an early age also thought maybe it wasn't enough, and I wanted to be doing these other things, and yet my 5 siblings, I was the only one who, I guess, had any talent at drawing. And so I was definitely encouraged. My second oldest brother, Andres, of course, was a poet. My eldest brother, Malachias, is an architect. And so there's, different creative outlets, but I was the only one who was like the visual artist. And I used to copy baseball cards and photographs when I was younger, but it was just, I think, I don't know, hobby, I'd say. But I continued doing it all the way through high school. I remember coming up with a portfolio and sending it for my college applications. I did try and take an art class when I was at Yale, but was quickly turned off just to the art department and the atmosphere that was there. And I think part of it was just like I wanted to enjoy it, and I felt like it was something that I found very nurturing. But again, the seriousness wasn't there yet. And all through college, I always wanted to be a lawyer. I thought I was heading to law school. But I was asked to do drawings for different publications on campus, and so I kept doing it. There was also funding available, and it was always nice to think about applying for like a travel fellowship over the summer. And so the first summer that I was able to travel and do artwork as part of the fellowship was to Guanajuato, Mexico, and I went with my cousin Tomas and another friend. And my cousin Tomas is the son of Maceo Montoya, and he's also an artist. And so that was a very exciting time that we were talking about, I guess, the legacies of our family, what we've inherited from our fathers, and whether or not we were prepared or ready to kind of commit ourselves in the same way. And it was exciting to have those discussions with Tomas. At the same time, I still wasn't able to commit. And the following summer, I got another travel fellowship to go around Latin America and sketch and draw. And I think at that time, I even was, like, it felt so, like, what was I doing that amounted to anything? It wasn't tangible enough. I was just making these drawings and observing, and I felt very isolated and alone. And I thought, like, what I wanted to do, I guess, with my life, socially, politically, I needed to be more concrete. So entering my senior year, again, really thinking about moving further away from the arts. But I was asked to paint a mural with Francisco Delgado, who was an artist from El Paso, and he was there at Yale getting his MFA. He was in his second year. And we were asked to work on a design for La Casa Cultural, the Latino Cultural Center there on campus. And to watch Francisco in his studio, to see him work, I really admired his work. To see someone who had taken that, made that decision to dedicate himself to his craft, that was very inspiring. And so we worked on that mural, on the design. And we ended up painting it, and it was over spring break that we painted the mural. And I remember just not wanting to go home at the end of the day. I wanted to stay out there. And then when I would go back, finally pulled me away from the wall, and I wouldn't be able to think of anything else. I wasn't able to sleep. I wanted to be there painting, and it was just like this. I was intoxicated with just that experience. And I think it hit me then that this is something that you have to follow that feeling. Right? There's something there. And so I was going to take the year off following my undergrad. I was going to save money, study for the LSAT. But in doing that, I was also going to try to commit myself to see if it fulfilled me, if the day in and day out I could be in my studio painting. And I moved to Knights Landing, which is this little town that was close to where I grew up, and just rented a room and spent just almost a year just painting. And that's when I first started writing, and I completely forgot about law school after that. And I haven't looked back.
That's great. So you received your MFA from Columbia University in 2006. Could you tell us more about your experience as a Chicano painter in these workshops at Columbia?
Well, what was interesting is, the question, as my experience as a Chicano painter. When I was in New York, and often like on the East Coast, no one knew what a Chicano was, and so I would just say, well, I'm Mexican or Mexican American, or it was just it took too long to explain, and I often felt very, very isolated. I wasn't the only, I guess, Chicano in the program. There was a Chicano or Mexican American from LA, the artist Fay Ray, and we both, I think, that similar feeling of being in this program, very prestigious program. At that time, it was kind of like the MFA program to be part of if you wanted to be like in the art world, if you wanted to be in New York creating as an artist, and so I feel like we found each other, and we're a great support and comfort to one another because we desperately needed it. I think you can trying to explain over and over what it is that you do, where it is that you come from, why it is that the kind of art that you're creating, why it's important. It gets exhausting, especially because you have to start from the very beginning. I never felt the need to convince myself that painting about the undocumented workers in Knights Landing, where I had been living, was important. But I found that once I got to Colombia, I had to have that explanation, or I had to make that explanation over and over. Why telling these stories? Why making narrative paintings? Why giving or shedding light on this experience that was, is all too often overlooked? Why it was important, and often, finding people skeptical of that. And I, over and over again, and I guess again it goes back to my family and my upbringing and my understanding of the arts, was that it was always, it was for someone else, it was for a community, it was for this like greater cause. And even though my work, I think, was different from like the political posters that like my father made, or talking about a specific political issue, I felt like my stories were more intimate. I still felt like it was beyond myself, and that I wanted it to be able to like create something in the world, not the art world. Whereas like where I was in my program, the rules that they played by, the conceptual, the formal understandings of their work, it was completely removed, I'd say, from where the inspiration for my own work, which was always based on like what I felt in my heart, what I felt in my gut, what moved me, what inspired me, just that's what got me into the studio, and no one else was talking about that when I was in grad school, and I felt that was very frustrating at times.
Do you think compared to back then, now there's more of an awareness, like about what Chicano art is trying to do, why is it important and such?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I feel like it wasn't that long ago.
That's true.
Yeah, but if I had gone to school even 5 years earlier, there would have been a resistance to even the fact that I was doing figurative art, narrative art. And I think that I did find faculty that were at least supportive of visually of what I was trying to do, that didn't necessarily care about, like I said, like the politics of it, or the cultural aspect of it, but that were very supportive when it came to, paint, pay what you want to paint. And there was other figurative painters that were in the program as well. But yeah, I think that, Chicano art on the map of world art, still occupies a very small space. At the same time, we're not doing anything different than artists around the world are doing when it comes to responding to their community, responding to their environment, responding to their sense of themselves or their identity. We're responding to our condition as human beings. I would say what often um, it comes into conflict when it in the art world, in the center of the art world, which I guess continues to be New York, is we're seen as like a subgroup of American art, right? And that could often be, okay, well, these are Latino artists or African American artists, or but we're a part of world art, and that what we're talking about are these same universal values.
Yeah. Thank you. How did you come to write? Was there some sort of like transition between when you were a painter to when you became a writer? And on that note, what was it like to write your first book, The Scoundrel and the Optimist?
Yeah. So when I was in Knights Landing, when I moved there after my undergrad and was going to, like I said, set up in a room and just paint, I created a couple of paintings that the community members, whether it was like the lady who I rented the room from, or I played on a soccer team with guys who were undocumented workers, they were field workers. They were curious as to what I was doing in town, and so they came over and would look at my paintings. And other people that I met, they were always curious and wanted to see my work. And so a lot of the paintings were based on people from Knights Landing. And they always had these details that they wanted to share when they recognized who the person was. And there was one painting about a man named Jose El Charan. For one, just the guy's name, he was named after El Charan, where he was from, El Charan, Michoacan. They talked about how in my first interaction with him, I couldn't understand what he was saying, and it was because he didn't have any teeth. Other people called him like the Wayside Guardian, or they knew him as the man who picks up cans. And then this other story that they told about how one time he caught 43 rats at the Wayside, which was just this like dilapidated apartment complex, and he strung them on a clothesline. So when I would hear all these details, and then I'd look at my painting, it was almost, which I thought complete, which I felt it captured whatever moment I wanted to capture. Those details were missing. And so I wanted to find a way. These were details important to the viewers, to the community, to the people who knew these figures that I was depicting. How do I include them? Do I include text on the canvas? And what I eventually did was start to write down these details. They were long titles at first, and then they became like little short paragraphs, and then they got longer and longer until they became short stories. And then at some point I was getting more and more excited about what I had. These stories that would be told visually, but then also through prose. I started to invent and bring in characters of my own, and that eventually became that was my first attempt at writing a novel. And I saw it being told in two different ways. The images, they weren't illustrations for the story; they were their own thing. They told part of the story that wasn't in the narrative form, in the written form. And it became the dreams of Juan Jose and other stories of Knights Landing. And I weaved all those stories into a novel. And to this day it sits as a file on my computer. But like that's what started it. And I think that after that I understood that just as I had spent a year every day focusing on teaching myself how to paint, that I had to do the same thing with my writing, because they weren't necessarily at that point like on the same level. So after that I moved to Mexico, and I was there for almost 6 months, and I just had a suitcase full of books and was looking for another small town, and I attempted to write another novel, and got about 200,000 words in and realized that I was completely lost, and I didn't know where I was going with it. And that's when I found out that I'd gotten into Columbia, and so that I was going to be going to graduate school. So that's what brought me back. But it wasn't until, I guess when I was at Columbia, I had a couple of friends from undergraduate who were there, who were also writing, and we would share chapters. And so I started a third novel, which that one I still hope sees the light of day. But it wasn't until after I graduated Columbia, returned home to Elmira, and then eventually moved to Woodland, where I am now, that I started writing The Scoundrel and The Optimist. But that had its origins in a painting that I made when I was in graduate school about a father and a son who were found in the desert. The father had died, and the 14-year-old boy was next to his dad. And when I made the painting in graduate school, I wanted to capture that moment of where the father's, is he dead? Is he about to die? Is he just, exhausted, and they're there resting in front of this giant boulder, which is providing them something of shade. That's the moment that I wanted to capture. And when I had people come into my studio, whether it was my peers in the program or the faculty, we also had this whole visiting artist or visiting art critic program. Everyone was met with complete indifference. They could care less what the scene was depicting. In a way, the response was Diego Rivera. That was the one Mexican artist that he was painting poor Mexicans 70 years before. What are you doing different? Right? Whether it was conceptually or formally. And again, that was the focus when I was in graduate school. What conceptually and formally are you doing new that's innovative? And I couldn't stand by my painting and say wait, this is a story that just happened. This is what's new. This is the story that I want to convey. You can't stand by your work. And so I saw it as a challenge for me as an artist, but also as thinking of myself as a storyteller. Okay, how can you grab this indifferent audience in a different way? And so I set about trying to tell that same story, how that father and his son ended up there in the desert, to tell it through prose, through fiction. And I found that when I started writing that story, instead of it being that somber, dark moment, even though I knew that that's where it was going to end, that I was telling these lighthearted, humorous stories, and that the tone had completely shifted. And so I kind of just ran with it, and that's what ended up being The Scoundrel and the Optimist.
So technically, it is your fourth novel.
Yeah, technically it's my fourth novel. No, I once read, it was I don't know, this in Poets and Writers, some guy was writing, and this was early on, and how he had written 10 novels and had published one. And I was horrified by that thought. That's almost the case. I had 2 novels published, but there's a whole bunch that are still just files on my computer.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, could you please read us the first chapter of this book?
Sure.
I feel like it really sets the tone for the rest of the story, that first chapter.
All right.
It's up until here, I believe? Yes.
Okay. Of Filastro Agustin's 7 children, the only one he couldn't bear to beat was his youngest son, Edmund. There were, to be exact, 3 reasons for this. First of all, Edmund was a very fragile boy. His head seemed much too large for his puny body, his limbs merely an assortment of sticks. Filastro firmly believed in good, solid beatings, not just for his own children, but also for his nephews and the neighborhood riffraff, not to mention his wife, and, when drunk, just about anyone. But Filastro also firmly believed in one's right to live, and he had reason to worry that his sickly-looking child might very well die if dealt too serious a blow. The second reason follows the first. Filastro, worrying about his son's fragility, took him to the doctor and asked point blank, "Doctor, I'm worried that if I beat him, I might kill him. What is your opinion? Is it safe?" The doctor examined the boy from head to toe, checked his pulse, peered into his tonsils, and hit his knee with a small mallet. "I think this boy would be perfectly fine with a good beating from time to time," said the doctor in his final analysis. "Well, that's fantastic," Filastro exclaimed, his face radiant. "But," continued the doctor, "there's something you should be careful about." "And what is that?" Filastro asked. "His psychological state," replied the doctor. "His what? Just what in the hell are you talking about?" "It means that bones and flesh heal, but feelings do not." What do you take me for, a sissy, doctor? Don't give me that schoolgirl shit. What do I care about feelings? You must care, the doctor implored. If his psychological state is damaged, you never know what might happen. Dreadful consequences. Remember, Filastro, you won't always be a young man. In fact, you'll soon be an old man. And what will happen when you're half blind and feeble, dependent on your children to feed you, to house you, to fiddle with the antenna when the television gets fuzzy? You'll be all alone if you damage your children's psychological state. Who knows? Maybe you'll damage it too much, and you won't even make it to old age. I've heard stories of patricide that you wouldn't believe. The doctor discreetly winked at Edmund. Just the other day I read in the paper that 3 sons killed their father over a lousy 10 pesos. On their walk home, Filastro asked Edmund if he believed his siblings' psychological states had been damaged. Yes, I think so. What about yours? I'm fine, Papa, Edmund responded, smiling, but I'd feel better, maybe, if I had a guitar. So Filastro resolved that although his son was strong enough to be dealt a few swift kicks from time to time, he needed at least one of his children to possess a sound psychological state. You will tell me if your brothers are plotting against me, right? He asked Edmund frequently. Yes, Papa, Edmund would say, strumming a chord on his new guitar.
Thank you.
25-year-old Maceo.
Still great. Well, that was the first chapter, but I was also very intrigued by the last chapter of your book, where patrolman Percival Ruiz, and he's working with the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, make an appearance. And I felt it complicated more like the border crossing stories, because we usually get to see just one side, but we get to see this other side in this last chapter. And I was just wondering, where did that story come from for you, and what prompted you to include it?
Yeah. Well, I actually, so in wanting to tell this story, which I thought was about, it's about immigration, about the story of these people, the father and son attempting to cross, and I came across that the story, the anecdote of the boy found next to his dead father in a New York Times article that was talking about as the increased militarization of the border was pushing people to find more dangerous ways of crossing, and the article just detailed all these different deaths that had occurred, and and just in a journalistic style, it was just what happened and then moved on, and that's what stood out to me when I wanted to tell that story and first attempted the painting, and then of course the novel, but again, just this idea that for so many of us, these are just numbers, right? The numbers of people that cross, the number that are here illegally, even the number of people who have died, not recognizing that each of those, they have their own story, and it's an incredible story. Leaving your home, leaving your homeland, attempting this incredible, what is an adventure, this incredible crossing filled with so much danger, just to in many cases, right, it's that idea of finding a better life. In the case of Filastro and Edmund, it was to go and find all the children who had left, who he had, ran out, so that he could go and he could apologize to them. So wanting to create this very specific individual story. At the same time, even though that's what I wanted to talk about, when I was living in Mexico and in this small town, Ayutla in Jalisco, I saw that that the United States and immigration to the U.S. Was such a gigantic part of their lives, that it wasn't like something separate. It wasn't a separate issue. It was completely intertwined with the relationships between husbands and wives, the relationships between parents and their children, even the relationship between siblings, those maybe who had been born there, and then others that were born in the United States, and those who have been afforded opportunities and those who hadn't, those who have lost their youth, work. I mean, it was everywhere. And yet they went about their daily lives. They fell in love. They raised families. They struggled. They made do, and there was always, for me, this idea of like immigration being in the background, as much it was like a large part of their life. And so even though I'm talking about this immigration story, Edmund is focused on his family, on his father, and of course on his love interest, and that's his focus. And I was reading, I was not sure how to pronounce the name, but Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, and he tells a story about these, I guess, I'm forgetting the specific details, but these like warring tribes and this conflict, and you follow the story all the way through, and then you get to the last chapter, and you see it from the perspective of like the colonial, whatever the policeman or the diplomat who's there, and it becomes in his eyes just this like tiny story, right? One of like many. Like he could hardly care less. Whereas throughout that novel, you're so immersed in the lives of the characters that are being created, and it's not until that colonial, the politician, or I forget exactly who it was, that you see it from the eyes of empire, which is that this is just a speck, that story. And so I wanted to kind of create that with The Scoundrel and the Optimist, is as it's viewed from the other side, as it's viewed from this immigration officer, that we start to draw back, we start to pull back from the story of Filastro and Edmund, and then it becomes just one of the many thousands of people that he's come across in patrolling the borders.
And yet he lets him go.
And yet he lets him go, yeah. And when I first wrote the story, it doesn't get to that point. I remember Edmund kind of gives up. And it didn't necessarily match the tone of what I had created or what I had built up until that point. And so it made me kind of rework the interaction between this INS officer. And there's no real villains in The Scoundrel and the Optimist. Even the abusive father, he has experiences. There's the possibility for transformation, and I think it would have been, if I had kind of created this, villainous, INS officer at the end, it wouldn't have fit again with the tone. This idea that we all have that transformation within us.
So you're a painter and a writer, and what are your thoughts on the relationship between like visual arts and words? And what about also poetry and prose? Because I ask this because like in your book, like the letters to the poet from his brother, you include like framed stanzas or paragraphs that go along with your plates, and which are your plates, the self-portrait from 15 angles, that I would describe as prose poetry. And would you consider them as such?
Yeah. When I was working on a lot of those pieces, I didn't know what to call them. I just called them narratives. And often like the narrative Cielo Rojo, which went along with the paintings. And when I would present the artwork, I would have it on a loop, and I would read the narrative. And so that's just, it served that purpose. It was a way of presenting the artwork and adding this other dynamic to it. But I think that for a long time, not knowing what they were was really troubling, and I just was afraid even to share them, because were they fiction? I never even considered them poems, to be honest. Were they just like mini essays or what? And I read a piece on this panel in Fresno, and David Dominguez, who's the editor, also a poet and editor of Packing House Review, he asked me to submit Cielo Rojo and another one called The Poet's Eulogy. And when they were published, Cielo Rojo was in the section on poetry, and Poet's Eulogy was in the section like creative nonfiction. And so I asked him why, and we went back and forth, and he provided a lot of great analysis of prose poetry. And so I understood, okay, like, but I didn't get why Poet's Eulogy, which I felt like came from the same place as the Cielo Rojo poem, why that was considered like creative nonfiction. Was it because there was, my brother was included as part of that story, or what? But in the end, I guess I realized that it doesn't matter what you call it. And so the way I labeled them, narratives, that's fine. Narrative poetry or prose poems. I don't consider myself a poet, and I'm kind of embarrassed. I don't read that much poetry. I'd say like that's the biggest reason why I'm not. And when I think about the poetry that I'm drawn to is narrative poetry, but that's because of my interest as a storyteller and my interest as a novelist. And when I think about how many novels it took me to write one novel, yeah, I can't say the same for poetry. Yet, I do think that what the similarities there is that we're a focus on imagery, a focus on the detail, the sensory details to like bring an image to life, to bring a scene to life. And I don't know. There was someone who wrote a review of The Scoundrel and the Optimist, who was, I guess, familiar with my artwork, and talked about how, as a writer, I create like this tableau, and you could easily see it being a painting. I wasn't aware of that at all, but it would make sense that my sensibilities as an artist would find their way into my written work. But when I was meeting with Copilot Press and Stephanie Sauer, the designer, about this play of imagery and text, I think she was very aware of how some of the images or some of the writings served as visual art, or visually as well. And there's that one section, self-portrait from 15 angles, where those aren't portraits, but she's created these frames, so it's almost as if you're like looking at these snapshots.
Right. They look like portraits.
Yeah.
So I have here an excerpt from the letters, and it says, "In our household, art was a tool wielded to fight injustice. It had the potential to transform the world, to preserve forever the memory of those forgotten, to give a voice to the humblest of our people. All of this was what it meant to be Chicano." And truly, throughout your book, you make the point the words and pictures can resurrect like a person, your brother in this case, a world, or convey a voice. And could you talk more about like how this power of art and word is connected to your identity as a Chicano, identity and responsibility as a Chicano artist, not only here in the U.S. but like in an international context?
Yeah. I guess, again, like, and I often talk about in the book how, separating, myself, and I see this as so deeply personal, and my relationship to Chicano and Chicanismo and Chicano art is in so many ways like my relationship to my father or to my brother, and their history. And, often when I talk about Chicano art and this larger idea and what it should be, I pull back, because really like I only feel comfortable talking about the way it was introduced to me and in my upbringing, and going out to my studio and seeing my father at work and seeing him talk about how there was a time where he didn't have this voice, and that through the Chicano movement and through his art, he was able to become fully human in many ways, and how he saw that replicated in so many ways. Other artists, other writers, other people who had been touched by the movement, the excitement of that time, and so of course that would find its way into my own voice as an artist, and understanding that when I go into the studio or I sit down to write, that I'm tapping into that emotion, that history, that energy, and again also that understanding that I'm all of this is emerging from within me. At the same time, I have been touched by, whether it's my family or by my community, or my sense of myself as a Chicano. And all of that, I find very difficult to articulate, and even to ask of others to feel the same way, so that someone else who identifies as Chicano, or is maybe they feel that they're not Chicano but Mexican American, or Latino, that they should have a similar understanding of Chicano art, or Chicano identity. And yet at the same time, I think that Chicano, the art movement, but also Chicano as a way of understanding the world, of putting a name to experience, of negotiating the in-between, wherever that is. I feel the in-between, even the fact that my mother's Jewish and my father's Chicano, and navigating that in-between. Or the in-between of I grew up in this small rural town, and I went out to the East Coast, and I was at Yale and Columbia and in New York, and there was always the maneuvering, the negotiating that I'm conscious of. I feel like that's not exclusive to the Mexican American or the Chicano community. That's a very universal thing, and I feel like there's so much richness there. There's so much I guess so much to explore, that should be explored. And for me, I put a name to it, and that's Chicano art.
Okay. I really loved Cielo Rojo in your book, and it was like really beautiful and painful too. And is it okay if you read us an excerpt from it?
Sure.
And I will ask you to read from, so long, from here to here.
Okay, sure. They keep coming, rapping on the metal curtain, until I open the door, expecting it just to be the sounds of night never heard during the day, like the creak of a swiveling vent. But they are there, more shadows than men, like the one on that first night who stood there in the moonless darkness and asked me without preliminaries, "Cuánto me cobras?" How much will you charge? Charge you for what? I responded. And he said, I keep dreaming that I'm going toward a blue sky, but when I awake it's always red. The sky is red, don't you understand? And after a pause he asked again, ¿Cuánto me cobras? And I told him that he must be mistaken. I just used this warehouse, I said. Who is it that sent you? And he shook his head as if I were the one mistaken and said, don't you see, I keep expecting the sky to be blue, but it's always red. And before I could tell him again that I didn't understand, he continued, insisting on being heard, on being understood. I came here years ago, he said. I came here with dreams. I came here believing the stories I'd heard, that one day I would be my own boss, have my own business, my own house, that I would be able to tell my children, see, mijos, his hand drawing an invisible line in the air. This is what I was then. This is what I am now. How much will you charge me? And I said again, I don't understand. Charge you for what? What is it that you want? And he shook his head in agitation. It's just that every time I walk outside, I expect the sky to be blue, but it's always red, don't you see? And without waiting for me to say no, he began again. I hurt my back, he said. I can't work. I can't work. What is a man who can't work? I'm not a man anymore. I used to have dreams. That's when I was a man.
Thank you. And for our last question, I'm aware that there's a new book coming, and it's called You Must Fight Them, a novella and a story collection, right?
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about it, or maybe a teaser?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, I see. So the novella "You Must Fight Them" is one of two woodland stories, and so "Deportation of Wapra Barasa" was the first woodland story, and that's about a young man who got his fourth DUI and was deported back to Mexico, deported to Mexico, and he hadn't been there since he was 3 years old. His parents had immigrated and brought him, and so all he knew was Woodland, essentially. And the only place he knew to go in Mexico was his father's small town, which was this little rancho outside of Michoacan, La Piedad, Michoacan. And that was a story that I overheard. It happened to a friend's brother. And when I overheard it, I couldn't believe. I just thought about it, and it just stuck with me. And what was it like before he left? What was it like when he got there? And like, how did he recreate his world, being deported to this completely foreign place? And so that became the deportation of Wapra Barasa. And wanting to tell that story of both Woodland and also La Piedad and its outskirts. And then the other story, You Must Fight Them, is something else I overheard at a party. And a friend had dated a girl in high school who, in order to date her, you had to fight her 3 brothers first. And that was just mentioned, like, yeah, I fought them, and then the relationship didn't last long. And I was like, what? What kind of world is this that I've come to? And I've lived in Woodland for 8 years and have met all walks of life and many different people. And I could easily see myself like, what if I met this girl who they said that she was beautiful, right? And what if I met her and someone like me? And so I came up with a character who went to school on the East Coast, who was half Mexican, half white, ended up back in Woodland, and they meet. And he wonders, am I going to have to fight her 3 brothers? And so that's kind of over his head, the entire story, the entire course of the novella. Will he have to fight them? Will he fight them? How does he sort through that? And then the others, some of them are stories of Woodland. I see it that whole region. There's another one about Knight's Landing, and all first-person male narrators. And I didn't realize it when I was working on each story or the novella on their own. But when I brought them together and stepping back, I saw that each character was kind of struggling with his masculinity and how he defined it, so that the collection as a whole, I see in some ways an exploration of that.
Well, I look forward to it.
All right. Yeah, I think it'll be fall of this year, 2015.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.